Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. Today, I'm telling you 7 scary and creepy true stories from the Appalachian Mountains. These are real horror stories that happened to normal people who went into the deep mountain woods. Even people who live in these mountains and know them well are too scared to talk about what they've seen in the dark forests. But before we start, please hit that subscribe button for Mr. Cursed. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Just leave a comment below. Your support really helps me make more scary true stories for you. Now let's get into these frightening encounters from the Appalachian Mountains. I'm 52 years old, and honestly, I never thought I'd be the type of person to believe in things I couldn't explain. My name's Carol Henderson, and I spent 28 years working as a park ranger at Blue Ridge National Forest. I loved that job, loved the mountains, the quiet, the way every day brought something different. I was good at it too, knew those woods better than my own backyard. But I had to take early retirement 3 years ago, and I've never told anyone the real reason why. Until now, I guess. Looking back, I wish I'd quit sooner. Might have saved myself a lot of sleepless nights. The whole thing started in the spring of 2020, right before everything went crazy with the pandemic. I'd been getting reports from hikers about hearing children crying deep in the forest. At first, I figured it was just the usual. Foxes make sounds that'll fool you, and owls can sound downright human sometimes. I'd been in those woods long enough to know how they can play tricks on your ears, especially at dusk or early morning when sound carries different. But these reports kept coming in, and they weren't from city folks who didn't know a coyote from a house cat. These were experienced hikers, people who'd been on trails their whole lives, and they were all describing the same thing: multiple children crying for help, sounding scared and desperate. The weird part was it was always coming from the same general area, Devil's Hollow, about 8 miles off any marked trail. That section of forest was remote even by our standards, thick with old-growth trees and rocky terrain that made it tough to navigate. I started taking solo trips out there to investigate. As a ranger, I had access to restricted areas that regular hikers couldn't reach, and I figured if there really were kids in trouble, I needed to find them fast. The first few times I heard nothing but normal forest sounds. Birds, the small animals rustling through leaves, wind in the trees. But on my 4th trip out there, around mid-afternoon, I heard it. It was definitely children crying. Multiple voices, different ages, all calling for help. The sound was clear as day, maybe 100 yards deeper into the hollow. After 28 years in those mountains, I knew every animal sound you could imagine, and this wasn't foxes or birds or anything else with 4 legs. These were human children, and they sounded terrified. I followed the crying, pushing through thick underbrush and over fallen logs. But the strangest thing happened. As soon as I got close to where the sound was coming from, it would stop completely. Then I'd hear it again, but from a different direction, like the source was moving. I spent 3 hours out there that day, chasing those voices, but I never found any sign of kids. No footprints in the soft earth, no dropped toys or clothing, no broken branches at child height. Nothing. That night, I started cross-referencing the reports with our missing persons database. What I found made my stomach drop. Over the past 15 years, 12 children had gone missing in our forest. All of them between ages 5 and 10. All of them disappeared while their families were camping, usually while playing near their campsites. The search efforts had been massive. We'd brought in helicopters, tracking dogs, volunteers from 3 counties. But we never found so much as a piece of clothing. Eventually, all 12 cases were closed as lost in wilderness, which basically meant we assumed they'd wandered off and died of exposure. I started mapping the exact locations where hikers reported hearing the crying and where each child had vanished. The pattern was unmistakable. Everything formed a rough circle around Devil's Hollow, like something was marking territory. That's when I decided I needed to go deeper into the restricted area, places where even rangers rarely went. What I found in the hollow changed everything. Hidden among the thick trees were structures built from branches and stones, but they were too large and complex for any animal I knew. They looked almost like shelters, carefully constructed and weathered by years of use. Inside these shelters, I found things that made my hands shake. Children's toys, pieces of clothing, a little girl's hair ribbon that matched the description from one of the missing person reports from 2018. But that wasn't the worst part. Connected to these shelters was a network of burrows that disappeared underground. The openings were too small for an adult to fit through, but they were perfectly sized for children. I used my flashlight to look as far into the tunnels as I could, and I saw evidence of long-term habitation, stored food, makeshift bedding, even crude wooden toys carved by hand. The crying sounds were coming from down in those burrows, echoing up through the tunnel system. I tried calling down, but the only response was silence. I knew I needed to see what was down there, but there was no way I could fit through those openings. So I went back to the station and checked out a remote camera, the kind we use to monitor wildlife. I lowered that camera down into one of the larger burrows, and what I saw on the screen still gives me nightmares. There were figures moving through the tunnels, pale, thin shapes that looked like children, but something was wrong with them. Their movements were too coordinated, too deliberate, and their eyes reflected the camera's light like a nocturnal animal's would. These weren't children playing or hiding. These were the missing kids, but they'd been changed somehow by years of living underground. I sat in my truck staring at that footage for hours, trying to make sense of it. The missing children weren't dead. Something had taken them underground and they'd adapted to life in the darkness. The crying sounds weren't distress calls. They were lures, meant to bring more children into the hollow. I knew I should report what I'd found, but who would believe me? And what if I was wrong? What if these really were the missing kids and they needed help? I made the decision that still haunts me. I was going to go down into those burrows myself and try to bring them out. I came back the next morning with climbing gear and a smaller flashlight. I found the largest burrow entrance and squeezed myself down into it. The tunnel sloped down at a steep angle, and after about 30 feet, it opened into a large underground chamber. That's where I found them. All 12 missing children sitting in a circle in the dim light. They looked up when I dropped into the chamber, and I could see they recognized the ranger uniform. Their eyes were huge and pale from years without sunlight, and their skin had a grayish tint, but they were alive. A few of the older ones even smiled when they saw me. "Are you here to help us?" one little boy asked. He couldn't have been more than 7, but I recognized him from the missing person photos. Tommy Chen disappeared in 2017. "Yes, I'm here to take you home," I told them. "Your families have been looking for you." But when I tried to lead them toward the tunnel I'd come down, they became agitated. They backed away from me, shaking their heads. "We can't leave," said a girl who looked about 9. "Mother won't let us, and the surface world is dangerous." That's when I heard footsteps coming from a tunnel that led deeper underground. The children all turned toward the sound, their faces lighting up like they were excited to see whoever was coming. A figure emerged from the darkness, and every muscle in my body locked up with terror. She called herself Mother, but she wasn't human. She had to be 7 feet tall, with skin that looked like tree bark and eyes that glowed with their own light in the darkness. Her limbs were too long, her fingers too thin, and when she moved, she made no sound at all. "You've come to visit my children," she said, and her voice sounded like wind through dry leaves. "How wonderful!" The children gathered around her like she was their actual parent, and she stroked their hair with those impossibly long fingers. She told me she'd been rescuing children from neglectful families for over a century. In her underground realm, they were safe from cars and pollution and violence. She'd convinced them that their birth families hadn't really wanted them, that they were better off in the darkness with her. "You can stay too," she told me. "Help me care for them. But you must understand, no one leaves. Ever." I played along, pretending to consider her offer while I looked for another way out. When I spotted a different tunnel that seemed to slope upward, I told her I needed to get something from my truck first. She nodded, but I could tell she was suspicious. I managed to reach my radio and called for backup, but Mother heard the transmission. Her face twisted with rage, and she let out a sound like breaking branches. The tunnel I'd come down suddenly collapsed, sealing us in. Rocks and dirt crashed down, and I dove to avoid being crushed. In the chaos, I found the other tunnel and ran. It was narrow, and I had to crawl on my hands and knees, but it did lead upward. Behind me, I could hear Mother calling to her children, telling them I was trying to take them away from safety. Some of them were crying. Real crying this time, not the luring kind. I don't know how long I crawled through that tunnel, but eventually I saw daylight. I came out through a hidden opening about 2 miles from where I'd gone in. My uniform was torn, my hands were bleeding, and I was covered in dirt. But I was alive. I never went back to Devil's Hollow. I submitted my retirement papers the next week and moved to Florida to live with my sister. I told everyone I was ready for a change, that I wanted to be closer to family. The truth is, I couldn't sleep at night knowing the children were still down there, and that Mother was probably still calling to new victims. They found my phone 3 months later in a cave-in near Devil's Hollow. Officially, I'd gotten lost during a routine patrol and barely survived. The missing children cases are still open, but the search efforts stopped years ago. Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried harder to bring those kids out. But then I remember Mother's eyes and the way she moved without making a sound, and I know there was nothing I could have done. Those children belong to her now, and she'll keep them safe in the darkness forever. I still have nightmares about hearing children crying. Even here in Florida, sometimes I wake up thinking I can hear them calling for help. But I never go looking for the source of those sounds. I learned my lesson about following voices in the woods. The missing children cases remain officially unsolved. I'm 29 years old and I work at a gas station now, but back in 2013 I was operating ski lifts at Mountain View Resort up in western North Carolina. It was decent work, you know. Good pay for the area, and I got to be outside all day instead of stuck behind some desk. I'd been doing it for 4 seasons by then, so I knew that mountain better than most of the guys in management. The resort pulled in a lot of families from Atlanta and Charlotte who'd drive up for weekend skiing trips. Nice people mostly. Kids excited about the snow, parents trying to keep up with them on the slopes. It was the kind of job where you felt good about what you were doing, helping folks have a good time with their families. That winter started out normal enough. We had good snow coverage, the lifts were running smooth, and business was steady. But then people started going missing. Not all at once, just one here, one there. The kind of thing that happens sometimes on mountains, you know? People get overconfident, go off the marked trails, maybe hit a tree or fall into a ravine. Search and rescue would go out, usually find them within a day or 2. That's what we all figured was happening at first. The first one was this college kid named Derek, 20 years old, from Georgia Tech. He went up on the advanced trails one afternoon and just never came back to the lodge. His friends waited around until closing time, then came to find me at the lift station. I told them Derek had gone up around 2 o'clock, but I never saw him come back down. Could have taken a different route, could have gotten hurt, could have been a lot of things. Search and rescue went out that night with flashlights and everything. They found his skis and poles about a mile off the main trail, just sitting there in the snow like he'd taken them off and walked away. But no sign of Derek himself. 2 weeks later, it was a woman named Linda. She was up there with her family, husband and 3 kids. Experienced skier, the husband said. She knew the mountain, had been coming to Mountain View for years. She went down ahead of them to get hot chocolate ready at the base lodge, but she never made it. Her family found me when they got down, asking if I'd seen her. I hadn't. They searched for 3 days that time, never found so much as a mitten. Resort management was getting nervous. Can't say I blamed them. Bad for business when people start disappearing. They put out statements about user error and folks skiing beyond their abilities. Said people needed to stay on marked trails, follow safety protocols, that kind of thing. Made sense, I guess. But something about it didn't sit right with me. Derek and Linda weren't beginners. They knew what they were doing out there. So I started paying closer attention. Really watching the mountain, you know? And that's when I began to notice things that didn't make sense. There were these paths through the woods that weren't on any of our trail maps. They looked well used, though, like people had been walking them regularly. Problem was, they led away from the resort toward the backside of the mountain where nobody was supposed to go. That area wasn't developed at all, just thick forest and rocky terrain that the resort had never bothered with. I noticed something else too. Animals. Or rather, the lack of them. You spend enough time on a mountain, you get used to seeing deer, maybe some wild turkeys, squirrels, that sort of thing. But there were whole sections of the tree line where I never saw any animals at all. Even the ravens and crows wouldn't fly over certain spots. They'd circle around instead, like there was something down there they didn't want to get near. The third disappearance really got to me. This businessman named Frank, maybe 45, 50 years old. He'd been skiing alone on an intermediate trail, nothing too challenging. I was the one running the lift when he went up that morning, and I never saw him come back down. When his car was still in the parking lot at closing time, I knew he had another problem. I asked other skiers if they'd seen him. A few said yeah, they'd passed him earlier, and he'd been heading toward the back country. That bothered me more than I could explain. Why would someone like Frank, a guy who stuck to intermediate trails, suddenly decide to go exploring in unmarked territory? The next morning, before my shift started, I hiked out to look for signs of where these people might be going. I followed one of those unofficial paths I'd been noticing. About 2 miles from the nearest marked trail, I found Frank's jacket hanging from a tree branch. It was torn up pretty bad, and there were what looked like bite marks in the fabric. Big bite marks, like from something with teeth the size of my thumb. I followed the trail of disturbed snow from where the jacket was hanging. It led me to this cave entrance, hidden behind a bunch of fallen trees. The opening was big enough for a person to walk through, and there were drag marks in the snow leading right inside. I could smell something coming from that cave that made my stomach turn. Like rotting meat mixed with wet animal fur, but stronger than anything I'd ever smelled before. I didn't go in. I'm not that stupid. But I went back to the resort and started asking questions. Did some research in the local library, talked to a few old-timers who'd lived in the area their whole lives. What I found out made my skin crawl. Back in the 1890s, there had been reports of what people called mountain devils, things that would steal livestock and sometimes people too. The old stories said there was a family of something living in the deep caves that would hibernate all summer long and only come out during the winter months when food got scarce. The tourism industry had worked pretty hard over the years to bury those stories, didn't want to scare away visitors. But the stories were there if you knew where to look. I realized Mountain View Resort had been built right in the middle of whatever territory these things considered theirs. I tried to convince my supervisor to let me investigate with a small team before we called in outside authorities. Took some doing, but he eventually agreed. We went into that cave system with headlamps and climbing gear, following those drag marks deeper and deeper underground. About 200 yards in, we found this huge chamber. There were bones scattered everywhere, human bones mixed with deer, rabbits, other animals. And in the center of it all were 3 of the biggest, most terrifying things I've ever seen in my life. They looked like a cross between bears and apes, but wrong somehow. About 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. They had hands like humans, but with claws as long as my fingers. And one of them was wearing Frank's ski jacket like some kind of trophy. I could see other pieces of clothing, too. Derek's hat, Linda's scarf, stuff from people who'd gone missing over the years. These things had been hibernating, but our lights woke them up. They made sounds like angry bears, but there was something intelligent in their eyes. They knew we didn't belong there. And when they moved to block the cave entrance, I realized they weren't going to let us leave. We used emergency flares to create smoke and confusion. The creatures didn't like the bright light or the smell, and it gave us enough of a distraction to run. They followed us partway out, but stopped when we reached sunlight. I guess they really were nocturnal, or maybe they just didn't want to leave their territory during the day. Resort management tried to bury our report, but I threatened to go to the media. They agreed to close the backcountry trails and post warnings about dangerous wildlife, the MIAs. FBI investigated, concluded the disappearances were animal attacks by unknown species. They sealed the cave system, but I know those things probably found other ways in and out. The resort added more safety measures after that. Required guides for all advanced trails, put up more warning signs. No more tourists disappeared that season, but several maintenance workers reported seeing large shapes moving through the woods at night. I transferred to a different mountain the next year. Couldn't work there anymore, knowing what was living underneath. Every winter I still wonder if those things are still out there, waiting for some tourist to wander too far from the marked trails. Looking back now, I realize how lucky we were to get out of that cave alive. And I think about Derek and Linda and Frank and all the other people over the years who weren't so lucky. Sometimes I see missing person reports from other mountain resorts, and I wonder if maybe those things aren't the only ones of their kind living up in the hills. I don't ski anymore. Don't even like being in the mountains if I can help it. Some experiences change you, you know? And this one changed me for good. I was 38 in 2008, driving a school bus through the back roads of Kentucky when I started noticing things that didn't sit right. I'd been working that same route for 12 years by then, picking up farm kids from all around Millfield Hollow every morning at 6:30 a.m. sharp. These were good families. Poor, sure, but they took care of their own. The parents would wave from their porches, and I knew every kid's name, their siblings, even their dogs. It was the kind of job where you become part of the community, whether you want to or not. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid closer attention to the warning signs earlier. Maybe I could have stopped what happened before it got so bad. The first time little Sarah May threw up on my bus, I figured it was just one of those things. Kids get carsick, especially on those winding mountain roads. But then it was Tommy, then Beth, then 3 more over the span of 2 weeks. All of them said the same thing. They'd eaten breakfast at home and felt fine until about 20 minutes into the ride. Their parents were embarrassed, apologizing and offering to clean my bus, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. These weren't kids who got motion sickness. I'd been driving them for years. It was Beth's mom, Clara, who first mentioned the feed mill when she came to pick up her daughter early one day. "We've been buying grain from that new place up near Crow's Ridge," she said while Beth sat pale in the front seat. "They're selling it cheap as anything, and it's supposed to be good enough for people to eat. The man said it's got extra protein for growing kids." The mill had opened maybe 6 months earlier, and I'd been driving past it every morning. Never saw any workers during the day, but there were always fresh tire tracks in the gravel lot. I started keeping a mental list of which kids were getting sick, and they all lived within maybe 5 miles of that mill. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. These families had been feeding their kids the same way for generations. They knew how to stretch $1 and make sure everyone got fed. So why were the kids suddenly getting sick after they'd found this cheap grain source? The mill itself looked normal enough from the road, just a concrete building with a metal roof and a big loading dock. But every time I drove past in the mornings, I caught this smell, sweet and thick, like something was rotting in sugar. It made my stomach turn, and I started rolling up my windows when I got near that stretch of road. The kids noticed it too. "Smells like candy," Tommy said one morning, "but wrong candy, like it's gone bad." I decided to stop by the mill one afternoon after I finished my route. The owner introduced himself as Ezra Cobb, a thin man with pale skin and hands that were too soft for someone running a grain operation. He was friendly enough, eager to show me around and explain how they processed heritage grains using traditional mountain methods. The building looked clean inside, though I noticed dark stains on the concrete floor that he said were from natural processing oils. When I asked about ingredients, Ezra just smiled and said it was a family recipe passed down for generations. He gave me several bags of samples to take home, explaining how the grain was specially formulated for growing children and had natural proteins that regular store grain doesn't have. The stuff looked like normal wheat and oats, but it had that same too-sweet smell I'd been noticing from the road. I took the samples to my friend Jenny, who worked at the agricultural extension office in town. "Just want to make sure it's safe for the kids," I told her. "Something about this whole situation feels off." Jenny ran some basic tests and called me back. 3 days later, with results that made my blood run cold. Unknown protein compounds, trace amounts of human DNA. "Janet," she said, "I don't know what this stuff is, but it's not grain." When I confronted Ezra about the test results, he just laughed. "Mountain folk eat what they need to survive," he said. "Always have. These families need protein, and we provide it." There was something in his voice that made my skin crawl. Something too confident, like he knew I couldn't do anything about it. I started researching the mill's ownership records at the courthouse. The land had belonged to the Blackwood family until 1987, when all 5 of them, parents and 3 kids, just disappeared one night. Never found so much as a scrap of clothing. The property sat empty for 20 years before Ezra bought it from the bank. I also noticed that the mill only sold to families with young children, never to single people or elderly couples. Always families with kids under 12. One night around 10 p.m., I drove past the mill and saw it lit up like Christmas. A refrigerated truck with no license plates was backed up to the loading dock, and Ezra was directing 2 other men who looked exactly like him. Same height, same build, same pale skin. They were unloading bags that definitely weren't grain. The bags were too heavy, and they handled them too carefully. I followed that truck to an old barn about 2 miles deeper into the hollow. Through the windows, I could see them working under bright lights. They had tables set up, and they were grinding something up in industrial meat processors, then mixing it with actual grain in big steel drums. The smell coming from that barn wasn't sweet anymore. It was rotten meat and something else I couldn't identify. I called Sheriff Morrison the next morning, but he said they'd already investigated the mill and found everything legal. Ezra's got all his permits, he said. Health department cleared him months ago. But when I pressed him on the test results, Morrison got defensive. Maybe you should stop stirring up trouble, Janet. Now, these families are getting cheap food. That's a good thing. The next day, Ezra was waiting for me at the school. He walked right up to my bus and knocked on the door with that same confident smile. I hear you've been asking questions about our operation, he said. We'd like to offer you a position. Good pay for keeping quiet about our business methods. When I refused, his smile got wider. We're helping these families, Janet. Poor mountain families need protein, and there's plenty of people go missing in these hills who won't be missed. I knew then that some of the local officials had to be involved. The health department clearance, Morrison's attitude, the way Ezra felt so safe threatening me in broad daylight at the school. I started warning parents directly, but most of them didn't want to hear it. The grain was too cheap, and money was too tight. It's probably just some kind of supplement, Clara said. My kids have been eating it for months. 3 more children got sick that week. One of them, little Amy Patterson, had to be hospitalized with stomach problems so severe the doctors couldn't figure out what was causing them. Her parents brought in a sample of the grain, and I begged the hospital to test it, but they said they'd already received clearance paperwork from the state health department. I couldn't sleep. Every morning, I drove past that mill knowing what they were doing, watching those families feed their children ground-up human remains mixed with grain. I broke into the mill one night around midnight, picking the lock on a side door like my dad taught me years ago. The main processing room was exactly what I'd feared. Industrial meat grinders covered in dried blood, freezer units full of human remains in various stages of processing, a wall chart tracking local families and their children's ages. In the office, I found missing person reports dating back 20 years, hikers, drifters, people traveling alone through the mountains. That's when I heard the truck pulling up outside. Ezra and his brothers caught me going through their files. They weren't angry, just disappointed. We've been recycling resources, Ezra explained while the other 2 blocked the exits. Poor families need protein to survive. Mountain people understand this. We take people who won't be missed and help them serve a purpose. The children need to grow strong, one of his brothers said. We're providing a service. They explained their system like they were proud of it. Missing hikers and transients went into the grain. Local officials were paid to look the other way. Families got cheap food and nobody asked questions because everybody benefited. Except you, Ezra said. You're interfering with charity work. I told them I'd already contacted the state police and FBI, which wasn't true but seemed like a good lie under the circumstances. Ezra just smiled. Local law enforcement handles things differently up here, he said. But we can add your family to our processing schedule if you keep causing trouble. I ran, made it to my truck and drove straight to the state police barracks 2 counties over. The federal agents I talked to seemed skeptical until I mentioned the missing persons reports and human DNA evidence. They raided the mill the next morning with a full forensic team. They found evidence of at least 15 missing people processed through that facility. The Cobb brothers were arrested, though they maintained they were helping poor families survive difficult economic times. DNA testing confirmed human remains in the grain samples. Several local officials were charged with accepting bribes to ignore the operation. The families who'd been buying the grain were devastated, but not charged as victims. Most of them moved away from the area within 6 months. I testified in federal court about my investigation and what I'd discovered in that processing room. The mill was demolished and the land was declared a permanent crime scene. I still drive a school bus route, different county now. I keep emergency snack supplies for kids whose families are struggling financially, and I always ask where their food comes from. I verify everything. Some people think I'm paranoid, but I know what happens when you don't ask enough questions. I never went back to Millfield Hollow. To this day, I take the long way around rather than drive past where that mill used to stand. I was 31 in 2016, working as a whitewater rafting guide on the Blackwater River in West Virginia. I'd been guiding for 8 years and knew every rapid, rock, and current on that river like the back of my hand. The Blackwater was a popular destination for adventure tourists from D.C. and Baltimore, city folks looking for a weekend thrill in the mountains. I loved my job, honestly. There's something about being out on the water all day, helping people experience the raw power of nature, that made me feel like I was doing something meaningful. I had a small cabin about 10 miles from the river outfitter where I worked, and I thought I'd found my place in the world. That summer started like any other. Tourist season was picking up, and we were booking tours almost every day. The river was running at good levels, not too high, not too low, perfect for rafting. But around mid-June, we started having an unusual number of accidents. And I mean unusual. In 8 years of guiding, I'd seen people fall out of rafts before. It happens, even to experienced rafters. But this was different. The accidents always happened at the same spot. Dead Man's Drop, a Class 4 rapid that I'd guided hundreds of times safely. It's a technical rapid, sure, but nothing that should cause problems for anyone who knew what they were doing. Over 6 weeks, 3 different people fell in, all experienced rafters who shouldn't have made that mistake. These weren't first-timers who panicked in rough water. These were people who'd been rafting for years. Each time the same thing would happen. The person would disappear underwater for several minutes, way longer than anyone should be able to hold their breath, before resurfacing downstream, about a mile downriver. We'd find them floating unconscious, and when they came to, they had no memory of what happened. Nothing. Complete blank from the moment. They hit the water until we pulled them out. But here's what really got to me. They all described the same thing before they went under. Every single one of them said they felt like something grabbed their paddle and pulled them in. Not the current, not a rock. Something grabbed it and yanked. My boss, Carl, said it was probably just the strong current and people panicking in rough water. "You know how it is, Lisa," he'd say. "People get scared. They imagine things." But I'd seen Dead Man's Drop claim people before, and this was different. The water level was normal, the current was what it always was, but something was definitely wrong with that section of river. I started paying closer attention when guiding groups through that rapid. I'd position myself where I could see everything, watching for any sign of what might be causing these accidents. That's when I noticed them. Disturbances in the water that didn't match the normal flow patterns. Little whirlpools where there shouldn't be any. Currents going the wrong direction. And shadows. Shadows moving under the surface that were too big and too coordinated to be fish. I tried talking to the other guides about it, but they thought I was being paranoid. "It's just a rough summer," they'd say. "These things happen in cycles." But I knew better. Something was in that water, and it was getting bolder. I convinced my friend Jake, who was a scuba instructor over in Charleston, to help me investigate. We went out early one morning before any rafting tours to dive in the deep pool below Dead Man's Drop. Jake brought all his gear, and we went down to see what was really going on. The water was murky, like it always is, but we could see well enough. The bottom was littered with old rafting equipment, dozens of paddles, life jackets, even entire rafts that had somehow been dragged down and never recovered. Some of that stuff had been missing for years. I recognized a few pieces from accidents I remembered, but in the deepest part of the pool, we found something that made my blood run cold. There was what looked like a constructed shelter made from river rocks. Not random rocks that had settled there over time. Rocks that had been deliberately stacked and arranged. The shelter was big enough for something human-sized to live inside, but it clearly wasn't made by people. The engineering was all wrong, like whoever built it understood structure but not human architecture. Jake found bones inside the shelter. Mostly fish and small animals, but some looked human. Old bones, weathered white. Jake held up what looked like a rib bone, and we stared at each other through our masks. This wasn't some animal den. Something was living down there, and it had been feeding. That's when we saw movement in the water. Something was watching us from the shadows on the far side of the pool. At first I thought it might be another diver, but as it got closer, I realized how wrong I was. A figure emerged from the rock shelter. It looked human at first glance. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But it moved through the water like it belonged there. Like it had never breathed air in its life. The thing had pale skin that looked almost scaled in the murky water, and its hands were webbed. I could see gills on its neck, opening and closing rhythmically. Its eyes were huge, black, designed for seeing in deep water. It swam toward us incredibly fast, faster than any human could move underwater. Jake grabbed my arm and pointed up. We kicked hard for the surface, and I've never been so grateful to breathe air in my life. We broke the surface gasping and swam hard for shore. Behind us I could see ripples in the water, like something was following just under the surface. We didn't stop swimming until we reached the rocks, and we didn't stop running until we got back to Jake's truck. I spent the next few days researching local folklore, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. I found stories about river people who'd lived in these mountains for centuries, long before white settlers arrived. The Cherokee had legends about water spirits who would drown anyone who disrespected the river or took too much from it. White settlers had reported similar encounters, but dismissed them as Indian superstitions. But I knew what I'd seen wasn't superstition. There was something living in that river, something that had been there long before tourists started showing up with their rafts and paddles, and it was getting tired of sharing its territory. I tried to warn the other guides, but they thought I was either lying or having some kind of breakdown. "You've been working too much, son," Carl said. "Maybe take a few days off." But the accidents kept happening. A week later, another rafter went under at Dead Man's Drop. This time, he didn't resurface. We found his body 3 days later, caught in some fallen trees about 2 miles downstream. The coroner said he'd drowned, but there were marks on his body that didn't make sense. Long scratches like from fingernails, but too deep and too perfectly spaced. I started secretly guiding groups away from Dead Man's Drop, using alternate routes that avoided that section of river entirely. I told people there was debris in the water, or the current was running too high, whatever I had to say to keep them away from that pool. Some groups complained. They'd heard about the famous rapid and wanted to run it. But I held firm. That's when the creature started following our rafts. I could see it swimming alongside us in the deeper sections, keeping pace with our boats but staying just out of sight of the customers. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of pale skin breaking the surface, or see the water move wrong where nothing should be. During one trip in late July, it surfaced near my raft. Just for a few seconds, but long enough for me to get a clear look at it. Up close, its face looked almost human, but the proportions were wrong. Its mouth was too wide, its eyes too large. It looked at me, really looked at me, and made sounds like it was trying to communicate. Not words, but intentional sounds, like it was trying to tell me something. I realized it wasn't malicious. It wasn't some monster trying to kill people for fun. It was defending its territory the only way it knew how. The more tourists we brought through its home, the more aggressive it became. It was trying to drive us away, and when warning didn't work, it got more direct. I had to make a choice. I could keep my mouth shut, keep collecting my paycheck, and watch more people die. Or I could do something about it. I reached out to some environmental groups in the area and started pushing for river conservation measures. I told them we needed to protect the ecosystem around Dead Man's Drop, that increased tourism was disrupting wildlife patterns. I didn't mention what kind of wildlife, but I pushed hard for restricted access to that section of river. It took months of paperwork and meetings, but eventually we got Dead Man's Drop designated as a protected conservation area. Commercial rafting was prohibited in that section. I convinced Carl to reroute all our tours around the creature's territory, telling him it was either that or deal with more lawsuits when people kept getting hurt. The accidents stopped immediately once we started avoiding that part of the river. The thing, whatever it was, seemed to understand that we were respecting its boundaries. I still see it sometimes when I guide tours past the conservation area. It watches from the banks, staying hidden from the customers, but letting me know it's there. Like we have an understanding now. Local Cherokee elders helped establish permanent protections for the area once they learned what was happening. They weren't surprised to hear about the river creature. Their stories had been warning people about it for generations. They just hadn't expected anyone to listen. I still work as a raftis and guide. I love the river too much to give it up completely. But I've become a lot more careful about respecting the places we visit. I train other guides about sustainable tourism, about watching for signs that wildlife might be stressed or territorial. I never tell them the whole story. They'd think I was crazy. But I make sure they understand that the mountains were here long before we were, and they'll be here long after we're gone. The Blackwater River is safer for tourists now. The thing in Dead Man's Drop has the protected habitat it needs, and people can still enjoy rafting on the rest of the river. But sometimes, late at night in my cabin, I still think about those bones in the rock shelter. How long had it been living down there? How many people had disappeared over the years, written off as drowning accidents or folks who just wandered too far from camp? I guess I'll never know for sure. But I do know this. There are things in these mountains that are older and stranger than most people want to believe. And sometimes, if you're smart and respectful, you can find a way to coexist. You just have to be willing to admit that you're not the only ones who call this place home. Back when I was 33, I made a living studying animals in places most people never go. I'm a wildlife biologist, or at least I was until 2018 when everything changed. My specialty was predator-prey relationships in remote mountain forests, the kind of work that meant camping alone for weeks at a time with nothing but camera traps and survey equipment. I'd been doing it for 8 years by then, and honestly, I loved the solitude. There's something peaceful about being deep in the mountains where the only sounds are wind through trees and maybe a creek running somewhere in the distance. That summer, I got assigned to survey a 50-square-mile section of the George Washington National Forest that hadn't been studied in decades. The area was accessible only by hiking trails, no roads, no cell service, nothing. Just pure mountain wilderness. I was supposed to document predator populations and their impact on deer, elk, and wild boar in the region. Standard stuff, really. Set up cameras, collect data, write reports. I figured it would be like any other job I'd done. The first week went pretty normal. I hiked in about 15 miles from the nearest trailhead, set up my base camp near a small creek, and started placing camera traps throughout the forest. The weather was good, my equipment worked fine, and I settled into the routine I'd done hundreds of times before. Wake up, check cameras, move deeper into the survey area, set new traps, analyze data at night by lantern light. Simple. But by day 8, I started noticing something weird. There weren't any large animals. I mean, there should have been deer everywhere. This was prime habitat. Thick forest, good water sources, plenty of food. But my cameras weren't picking up anything bigger than raccoons and squirrels. No deer, no elk, no wild boar. Nothing. I'd done surveys in similar forests before, and usually by the second week. I'd have hundreds of photos of various animals. This time, I had maybe a dozen shots of small mammals. At first, I thought maybe there was a disease outbreak or something. That happens sometimes. Chronic wasting disease can wipe out deer populations pretty fast. But I wasn't finding any dead animals either. No carcasses, no bones, no signs of illness. The smaller animals seemed healthy and normal. It was like something had just removed all the big animals from this particular stretch of forest. Then my cameras started getting destroyed. I'd go to check a trap I'd set up 3 days earlier, and it would be gone. Not knocked over by wind or damaged by weather, completely missing. The mounting brackets would still be on the tree, but the camera itself would be nowhere around. I lost 5 cameras in 2 weeks, which was more than I usually lost in an entire season. When I found the 6th one, that's when I knew something was seriously wrong. The camera was about 100 yards from where I'd mounted it, sitting in a small clearing like someone had carefully placed it there. The case was cracked open and all the internal components were scattered around in a perfect circle. Not torn apart like a bear would do, not random damage. It looked deliberate, organized, like something had taken the camera apart to see how it worked. I started finding tracks around the destroyed equipment, big tracks, bigger than any animal that was supposed to live in these mountains. They looked almost like cat prints, but way too large. A mountain lion's paw is maybe 4 inches long. These were closer to 8 inches, with claw marks that went deep into the soil. And there were always 4 perfect prints in a line, like whatever made them walked with purpose instead of wandering around like most animals do. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward areas where the trees grew so thick you could barely see 10 feet in any direction. I followed them for a while, but honestly, the deeper I went, the quieter everything got. No bird songs, no insect noise, nothing. Just my footsteps on dead leaves and the sound of my own breathing. After about a mile of that, I turned back. Something in my gut told me to leave it alone. But I couldn't leave it alone, obviously. This was my job, and I'd never encountered anything like this before. So, over the next few days, I started tracking more systematically. I'd follow the tracks for short distances, mark locations on my GPS, try to figure out movement patterns. What I found was disturbing. Whatever was making these tracks was systematically clearing animals from specific areas. I'd find kill sites, spots where deer or other large animals had clearly been taken down and eaten. But there were too many of them, and they were all fresh. Way more kills than any normal predator should make. A mountain lion takes down maybe 1 deer a week. I was finding 3 or 4 kill sites every day, all recent. The kill sites themselves were wrong too. Most predators drag their prey to cover before eating. These animals were being killed right out in the open, in small clearings where the killer would have a clear view of the surrounding forest. Like whatever was doing this wasn't worried about being surprised by other predators. Like it was confident nothing in these mountains could threaten it. I started documenting everything. Photos of tracks, measurements, detailed notes about kill sites and predator behavior. I'd been a wildlife biologist for 8 years, and I'd never seen anything like this. The hunting pattern suggested something that saw every other predator in the forest as competition to be eliminated. That's when I realized I hadn't seen any sign of mountain lions, black bears, or even coyotes in over 2 weeks. In a 50-square-mile area of prime mountain habitat, there should have been at least some sign of other predators. But there was nothing. Whatever was making those tracks had driven out every other large carnivore in the region, and it was watching me. I started noticing my equipment moved around at night. Nothing dramatic, just small things. My backpack turned a different direction. Research notes scattered by wind that shouldn't have been blowing. Boot prints around my tent that weren't mine. At first I thought maybe I was being paranoid, but then I found one of my data sheets about 200 yards from camp, folded neatly and placed on a tree stump like someone had been reading it. On my 18th night in the forest, I woke up to something walking around my tent. Not the random wandering of a curious animal. Deliberate, measured steps, around and around in a perfect circle, maybe 10 feet from where I was sleeping. I lay there listening for probably 20 minutes, trying to decide if I should look outside or just stay put. The steps were heavy, heavier than a person, but with a rhythm that seemed too regular for a 4-legged animal. When the sun came up, I found tracks all around my campsite. The same 8-inch prints I'd been seeing for weeks, but this time they formed a complete circle around my tent, like something had been studying me while I slept, trying to understand what I was. I should have left then. Looking back now, I can't believe I stayed another week. But I was so close to understanding what was happening in this forest, and as a scientist, I felt like I owed it to myself to get some kind of documentation. So I set up a new camera, hidden better this time, pointed at a clearing where I'd seen fresh tracks. 3 days later, I got the footage that changed everything. The camera caught it just after sunset. Something emerged from the tree line on the far side of the clearing, and for about 30 seconds, I had a clear view of what had been stalking me for 3 weeks. It looked like a cat, but wrong. All wrong. About 6 feet tall at the size. Holder, with a build that was too muscular, too heavy. The proportions were off. Legs too long, head too large, body too thick through the chest. Dark fur that seemed to absorb light, instead of reflecting it. And it moved without any sound at all, despite being the size of a small car. But what really got to me was how it acted. It didn't move like a wild animal. It walked to the center of the clearing, sat down on its haunches like a house cat, and stared directly at the camera. Not randomly looking around like an animal would. It knew the camera was there. It knew I was watching. And for 30 seconds, it just stared, like it was trying to figure out what I was and what I wanted. Then it stood up, walked over to where I'd been placing the camera traps, and looked back at the hidden camera one more time before disappearing into the trees. The whole thing felt like a message, like it was telling me it knew exactly what I'd been doing and where all my equipment was. I packed up that night, didn't even wait for morning, just stuffed everything in my backpack and started hiking out by flashlight. I'd never been so scared in my entire life, and I couldn't even explain why. The thing in the clearing hadn't threatened me, hadn't shown any aggressive behavior, but something about the way it looked at that camera, the intelligence behind its eyes, made every instinct I had scream at me to get out of those mountains. The hike back to my truck took me 6 hours in the dark, but I didn't stop once. When I finally got cell service again, the first thing I did was call my supervisor and tell him I was done with the survey. Made up some story about equipment failure and bad weather. I never told him what I'd really found out there. I spent the next few months analyzing the footage and all my field notes. I consulted with other biologists, even reached out to some cryptozoologists, though I never told them exactly where the footage came from. The consensus was that I'd documented something unknown, possibly a surviving population of some extinct predator that had adapted to avoid human contact. I lobbied hard for that section of forest to be designated as a protected area, off limits to researchers and hikers. Took almost a year, but eventually they agreed. Officially, it's listed as critical habitat for endangered species, but really it's to protect whatever's living in there from us, and us from it. I still work as a wildlife biologist, but I don't do solo surveys anymore, and I've never gone back to those mountains. Every few years I get reports from other researchers about unusual findings in remote forest areas. Missing animals, destroyed equipment, tracks that don't match any known species. When that happens, I make a few phone calls, and usually those areas get protection status pretty quickly. I don't talk about this much. Most people wouldn't believe me anyway, and honestly, I'm not sure I want them to. There are things in the deep mountains that have been there a lot longer than us. And maybe it's better if we just leave them alone. I learned that lesson once, and I don't need to learn it again. My name's Sarah, and I'm 31 years old. I work as a botanist for the University of Virginia, which sounds way fancier than it actually is. Most of my time gets spent trudging through muddy forests, looking for plants that most people would step right over without noticing. Back in 2017, I was doing research on rare orchid species in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the kind of flowers that only grow in places so remote you need a GPS just to find your way back to civilization. I'd been doing solo research trips for about 5 years at that point. My friends always thought I was crazy for camping alone in the middle of nowhere, but honestly, I felt safer in the mountains than I did walking to my car after working late at the lab. Wildlife doesn't really bother you if you know what you're doing, and I'd gotten pretty good at reading the forest. Plus, the solitude was exactly what I needed for the kind of detailed observation work I was doing. That particular summer, I was focused on a specific orchid species that only bloomed in these deep mountain hollows in Virginia. We're talking about places where you have to hike 12, maybe 15 miles through dense forest just to get close. The kind of terrain where your cell phone becomes a very expensive paperweight and your truck might as well be on another planet. But that's where these flowers chose to grow, so that's where I had to go. The research required me to camp out for weeks at a time, monitoring growth cycles and taking detailed notes on soil conditions, light exposure, all that technical stuff. I'd set up my little camp in what locals called Devil's Hollow. Not exactly a comforting name, but the botanist in me was more interested in the unique microclimate than whatever ghost stories might be floating around. During my third week out there, I started noticing something that didn't make sense from a scientific standpoint. Natural plants that should have been thriving in that environment were wilting and dying, but only in specific areas. At first, I thought it might be some kind of fungal infection or maybe soil contamination from old mining operations. The mountains are full of that kind of environmental damage. But when I mapped out the dying areas, they formed perfect circles, not the irregular patterns you'd expect from disease or chemical runoff. Actual circles, like someone had taken a compass and drawn them out. Even weirder, the circles seemed to follow some kind of logic I couldn't understand. Invasive plant species were dead or dying, while rare native plants in the same areas were not just surviving, but actually thriving better than they should have been. I started finding symbols carved into tree bark around these dead zones. They looked like claw marks at first, but they were too precise, too organized. Whatever made them understood geometry in a way that random animal scratches never would. The symbols appeared to follow botanical principles. They were always near plants that were either being protected or systematically removed. Looking back now, I should have been more concerned about what was making those marks. Instead, I got excited. As a scientist, I was seeing evidence of ecosystem management that was more sophisticated than anything human conservationists had achieved. Something was actively protecting rare native species while eliminating invasive ones, and it was doing it with surgical precision. The deeper I went into the forest, following the pattern of protected and destroyed vegetation, the more elaborate the ecosystem management became. I found areas where rare plants were being cultivated in what could only be described as hidden botanical gardens. Someone or something had created microclimates that allowed endangered species to flourish. The kind of contre-soi, old environments that would cost millions to replicate in a laboratory. I discovered evidence of selective breeding programs happening in the wild. Plants that shouldn't exist were growing. In carefully tended plots, new varieties that seemed designed to survive climate change better than their parent species. The level of botanical knowledge required to pull this off was staggering. This wasn't just preservation. This was active evolution, guided by an intelligence that understood plant biology better than I did. And that's when I started finding the footprints. They were in soft patches of soil near the most sophisticated cultivation areas. Human-shaped, but wrong. Too long, too wide, with spacing that suggested someone much taller than normal was making them. The prints were always found near plants I'd been looking for but couldn't locate on my own. Rare specimens that seemed to appear in my research areas like gifts. I began to realize that whatever was managing this forest knew I was there. More than that, it seemed to understand that I was studying plants, not destroying them. It was helping my research. Samples of flowers I'd been desperately seeking would show up near my campsite in the morning, carefully arranged with their root systems intact. On my final night camping in Devil's Hollow, I met it face to face. I was sitting by my campfire, updating my research notes on my laptop, when I got that feeling you get when someone's watching you. The forest had been unusually quiet all evening. No insects, no night birds, even the wind had died down to nothing. Just the crackling of my fire and the soft clicking of my keyboard. When I looked up, it was standing at the edge of my campfire's light. About 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like living moss and bark. It moved closer, and I could see that its skin had the texture of tree bark. Not like a costume, but like it had grown that way. Its hair wasn't hair at all, but actual moss with small plants growing in it. When it shifted, I could hear the soft rustling of leaves. I should have been terrified. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to run, but the thing moved so carefully, so gently around my equipment. It seemed genuinely curious about my laptop, my plant samples, my research notes. It never made any aggressive movements, never showed any sign that it meant harm. It communicated by arranging plants and flowers in patterns. complex arrangements that described ecological relationships I'd spent years studying. It was teaching me things about forest management that weren't in any textbook, showing me connections between species that I'd never noticed, explaining through living symbols how the mountain ecosystem actually worked. I spent the rest of that night learning from something that had been protecting these mountains for longer than humans had been keeping records. It showed me plant species I'd never seen before, evolutionary adaptations that existed nowhere else on Earth, flowers that had been selectively bred to survive the changing climate, root systems designed to prevent soil erosion, entire micro-ecosystems that had been carefully balanced over decades. When dawn came, it simply melted back into the forest. But it left behind a comprehensive botanical garden of specimens I could never have found on my own, along with a clear understanding that this was its territory, and I was welcome to continue my research as long as I respected that fact. I published several papers based on what I learned that night, describing unusual natural selection processes in Appalachian ecosystems. I never mentioned the guardian, obviously. Who would believe that? But I became an advocate for expanding wilderness preservation in that area, lobbying to protect the deep forest regions where it continued its work. I still make research trips to Devil's Hollow. Not as often as I used to. My teaching load has increased, and honestly, the experience. Changed me in ways that make regular human interaction more difficult than it used to be. But when I do go back, I'm never alone. The guardian and I have developed a working relationship. I help protect its territory from human interference, and it continues to teach me things about botany that no university could ever provide. The mountain wilderness where I first met it now has the most successful rare plant preservation program in North America. Scientists come from all over the world to study how we've managed to maintain such biodiversity in an era of climate change and habitat destruction. They ask me for my secrets, and I just tell them it's about respecting the natural intelligence of the forest ecosystem. If they only knew how literally true that statement is. I don't talk about this much. Most people wouldn't understand, and the few who might believe me would want to study the guardian, capture it, turn it into some kind of research project. That's not going to happen. Some things are more important than human curiosity, and after spending time with something that's devoted its existence to protecting life instead of studying it, I've learned to appreciate the difference between knowledge and wisdom. The mountains are in good hands. Better hands than ours, honestly. And sometimes, when I'm having trouble with a particularly difficult research problem, I know exactly where to go for help. Back when I was 27, I worked as a forest ranger in the Cherokee National Forest in eastern Tennessee. This was 2009, and I'd been doing the job for about 4 years at that point. I loved everything about it: the solitude, the fresh mountain air, being outdoors all day. Most people think being a ranger is just checking permits and maintaining trails, but there's a lot more to it than that. Part of my job included overnight patrols of the remote mountain trails, checking on backcountry campers and making sure hikers weren't getting themselves into trouble. I had a 40-square-mile section that I knew like the back of my hand. Every trail, every creek, every decent camping spot. I'd been doing night patrols for 3 years and honestly loved the quiet, peaceful feeling of walking those mountain paths under the stars. That all changed during the fall of 2009, and to this day, I can't bring myself to go hiking alone anymore. That October, we started getting some pretty concerning reports. 3 experienced backpackers had gone missing over the span of about 2 months, all solo hikers doing multi-day wilderness trips on the more remote sections of the Appalachian Trail. These weren't inexperienced weekend warriors who got turned around and lost. We're talking about people who knew what they were doing, had proper gear, and had been hiking for years. The search and rescue teams would find their camps with all their gear still there, tents set up properly, food hanging in bear bags, everything exactly as it should be. But the hikers themselves, gone without a trace. What really bothered me was where these camps were being found. They were always in the deepest parts of the forest, at least 15 miles from any road access. These were spots that most casual hikers never even see, tucked away in mountain valleys that you have to really work to reach. The missing persons were us, E-ports were stacking up, and our supervisor was getting pressure from higher up to figure out what was happening. I volunteered to take on some extra night patrols to investigate these remote areas. Looking back now, I'm not sure if that was brave or just stupid. Maybe both. But someone had to do it, and I knew those mountains better than anyone else on our team. Plus, I figured whatever was happening, there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the hikers had gotten injured and wandered off looking for help. Maybe there was a dangerous animal in the area that we weren't aware of. I never imagined it could be something else entirely. The first thing I noticed during my extended patrols was how quiet the deep forest had become. I mean, dead quiet in a way that wasn't natural. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that the mountains are never really silent, especially at night. There should be owls hooting, raccoons rustling through the underbrush, maybe the distant howl of a coyote. But in certain valleys, there was nothing. The silence was so complete, it made my ears ring. Animals that should have been active after dark were completely absent from these areas. No deer, no possums, not even any bugs chirping. It was like every living thing had decided to stay far away from specific spots in the mountains. When you've spent as much time in the wilderness as I have, you learn to trust that kind of animal instinct. If the wildlife is avoiding an area, there's usually a good reason for it. I started finding tracks around some of the abandoned campsites that didn't match any wildlife I knew lived in these mountains. At first glance, they looked almost human. The basic shape was right. But they were much larger than any person's footprint, maybe size 16 or 17 if they'd been made by boots. The weird thing was there were claw marks at the toe positions, like whatever them had long nails or talons, and these weren't shallow impressions either. Whatever made these tracks was heavy enough to leave deep marks in the forest soil, even in areas where the ground was hard and dry. As I kept investigating, I started finding personal items scattered along the game trails that led deeper into the mountains. Torn pieces of fabric caught on branches, a broken hiking pole, someone's water bottle with teeth marks in the plastic. The pattern was always the same. The items formed a trail that led away from the main hiking paths and deeper into the wilderness than most people would ever think to go. Following that trail of evidence, I ended up about 8 miles from the nearest marked trail, in a natural clearing I'd never seen before, despite all my years patrolling these mountains. The clearing was maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by the thickest forest you can imagine. What I found there still gives me nightmares. The whole area looked like some kind of feeding ground. Bones were scattered everywhere, mostly deer and other wildlife, but I could tell right away that some of them were human. I'm no expert, but you don't need a degree in forensics to recognize a human skull when you see one. There were backpacks and hiking gear arranged in neat piles around the edges of the bone scatter, like someone had been collecting trophies. I recognized some of the gear from the missing persons reports we'd filed. In the center of the clearing, there was this crude shelter built from branches and pieces of salvaged camping equipment. It was huge, had to be at least 10 feet tall and just as wide. The smell coming from inside was horrible. Rotting meat mixed with this heavy animal musk that made my eyes water. I didn't want to get too close, but I could see that the inside was lined with more bones and what looked like animal pelts. That's when I heard the footsteps. Something was moving through the forest around the clearing, and whatever it was big. I could hear branches breaking as it moved, but it stayed hidden in the thick trees just outside my flashlight range. My first instinct was to call out, thinking maybe it was another hiker who could help me understand what I was looking at. But something in my gut told me to keep quiet. The thing, and I couldn't think of it as a person anymore, started circling the clearing. I could track its movement by the sound of snapping twigs and the way the shadows seemed to shift in the forest around me. It was taking its time, like it was studying me, trying to figure out what I was doing in its territory. When I tried to leave the clearing and head back toward the main trail, it would block my path. I'd hear rocks being thrown in the direction I was trying to go, or a tree would suddenly crash down across the path I'd been following. It wasn't attacking me directly, but it was definitely keeping me trapped in that clearing, like it was deciding what to do with me. Around midnight, it finally showed itself. I've tried to describe what I saw to other people, but words don't really do it justice. It was humanoid, but only in the most basic sense. 9 feet tall, easy, with arms that hung down almost to the ground. Its whole body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its face was more animal than human. The eyes were intelligent. It was studying me the same way I might study a strange bug I'd found on a hike. The thing moved through the dense forest without making a sound when it wanted to. It was perfectly adapted to life in these mountains, could probably live here for years without anyone knowing it existed, which now that I think about it, it probably had been doing exactly that. I realized I was looking at something that had been systematically hunting people who ventured too deep into its territory. Solo hikers who wouldn't be missed for days, people who were experienced enough to get far from any help. It had been collecting studying their gear, learning about humans while staying completely hidden. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the clasp on my belt pouch, but I managed to get my emergency flare gun out. I fired the first flare straight up, and the bright red light seemed to confuse the creature. It stumbled backward, making this awful sound that was somewhere between a roar and a scream. I fired 2 more flares in quick succession, and that gave me the opening I needed. While the thing was distracted by the lights, I ran into the forest in what I hoped was the direction of the main trail. I've never moved so fast through dense woods in my life, crashing through branches and underbrush like my life depended on it, which, looking back, it probably did. The creature followed me for miles through the forest, but the flares had made it more cautious. I could hear it moving parallel to my path, staying just out of sight in the thick trees. Every time I'd stop to catch my breath or check my compass, I'd hear those heavy footsteps getting closer. I finally reached a main trail just as the sun was coming up, and I've never been so happy to see a familiar trail marker in my life. I immediately called for backup and search teams, but by the time we got back to the clearing with a full team of rangers and some state police officers, the creature was gone. Everything had been moved. The bone scatter, the gear piles, the shelter. All of it had been relocated deeper into the mountains where we couldn't follow safely. It was like the thing knew we'd be coming back and had cleaned up the evidence. We posted warnings about solo hiking in the deepest wilderness areas and increased our patrol schedules, but we never found any trace of the creature or its new campsite. The good news is that no more hikers disappeared after that. Whatever was out there seemed to understand that its territory was being watched now. But I couldn't handle patrolling those deep mountain areas alone anymore. Every sound in the forest made my heart race, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those intelligent eyes watching me from the shadows. I transferred to a different forest the following spring and eventually got out of ranger work altogether. Now I manage a hardware store in a small town in North Carolina, and I'm perfectly happy to stay in civilization. I still love the mountains, but I stick to the popular trails with plenty of other people around. Sometimes I wonder if that thing is still out there, deeper in the wilderness where no one goes anymore. Part of me hopes someone with better equipment and more backup than I had will find it someday and get some real answers. But mostly, I just try not to think about those intelligent eyes and the way it moved through the forest like it owned the place. Because maybe it did.